Hey everybody, Dr. Segrin again, another YouTube lecture for you. And this one is going to round out the first unit, which sort of covers Earth's history, giving you a little perspective on Earth. And our last bit of what we're going to learn about with the history of Earth is going to be the history of humanity. So how have humans changed over time, and how have they begun changing Earth over time? And this will be kind of a very short overview. Pretty much all of these topics will be going into more detail, but this sort of creates the overall picture of Earth and humanity that I want you to have moving forward. So let's get right into it. All right, so we're going to call this lecture Human History from an Environmental Perspective. And so to start this off, we will start off with our oldest human fossil. It is possible that humans were older than this and they just weren't leaving fossils behind. And I'm not going to go into where did humans come from. That'll be another subject for another day. But this skull right here is pretty much the oldest known human fossil, and it's called Hurto Man. And that's because he was found in the Hurto Valley in a country known as Ethiopia, right over here in the Horn of Africa. Hurto Man's life, probably you can kind of imagine what life would be like for an early human. We would call those early humans hunter-gatherers. And we can define this by saying that humans were essentially, for their food source, were gathering plants, fruits, berries, nuts, whatever, tubers, and they were hunting animals for food resources. You know, I think most of us are familiar with sort of the caveman image. That would have been what we assumed Hurto Man's life would have been like. And part of the reasons we can make the assumptions that this is what life would have been like back then is that we actually, near his fossil was a carcass of a butchered hippopotamus. And that tells us a couple things. They had tools, so there was some kind of primitive knife work on the carcass of the hippopotamus. It had been cooked, so some of the bones were charred, so they were using fire. And you can kind of deduce that to kill a hippopotamus, you would have to have at least a spear, and you would almost certainly have to be working in a group to do something like that. I suppose the hippopotamus could have died on its own, and humans were just scavenging it. Possible. Either way, you're in Africa, you're going to have all kinds of big predators there. To survive there, you probably needed some kind of tools and teamwork, and that would have been what life was like back then. So obviously humans are everywhere today, and we can, we said that the oldest human fossil was here in Ethiopia, and we said that was 160,000 years ago that fossil lived, that guy lived. The guy who left that fossil lived 160,000 years ago. And so all of these little things, all of these numbers on the screen that say a number and then K and then YA, that's K stands for 1,000 and YA stands for years ago. And so what actually the screen shows is the oldest human fossil that was found in each of these locations on Earth. So for example, the oldest human fossil in South Africa is 90,000 years old, and the oldest human fossil up here in North Africa and in the Middle East is about 80,000 years old. So what that means is, the assumption that scientists make here is that humans were pretty much confined to this location for a pretty long time, because the oldest human here, the oldest human fossil that was ever found was 90,000 years ago, and we assume that humans weren't there before that. That means that this original population slowly, eventually moved down to South Africa, but that process took the difference in these 2 years. So if we take 160 minus 90, we get 70,000 years. So for about 70,000 years, that's how long it took for the humans up here in Ethiopia to kind of migrate throughout Africa. And it took about 80,000 years for them to make it up to North Africa, and actually it would be around and out of Africa into the Middle East. So, it was pretty slow going at the beginning for humans. And after that, though, we start seeing additional expansion. First to the Pacific Islands in Australia. This is pretty much guaranteed, though, that at this point, human technology had advanced to the point of boats, because you're not making that journey without a boat. That is all islands over there. So definitely humans had boats at around 50,000 years ago. Humans also made it up into Europe in this time, so kind of spread up into Europe and also into the rest of Asia. So up into the northern China, Mongolia, Russia, Korea kind of areas. The interesting thing is that the places in the world with the youngest human fossils, which means that these were the last places on Earth that humans made it to, are the Americas. And humans have actually only been in the Americas for about 16,000 years, and South America for only about 14,000 years. And the leading hypothesis for how humans made it to North America first was that the human population up here in northern Asia at one point during an ice age, and we'll cover those later on in this course too, but that's essentially a period of time where the Earth gets cold. The assumption is that this portion of the northern Pacific Ocean, or the Bering Strait as we call it, basically froze over, and so pretty much all of this area up here was covered in ice, including just this little stretch here between northern Russia and Alaska. And that allowed this population of humans to move and make it into North America. And those would have been the Native Americans and the Native Central Americans and the Native South Americans. So all of the Native American groups, the Sioux and the Cherokee, and there's lots of them, and all the Central American groups, the Maya and the Aztec, and the South American groups like the Inca, all were part of this same population. And actually, when we do genetic analysis of humans, we see that those groups are closely related to each other, but also have shared ancestry with northeastern Asia, this population. So something else I'm going to talk about in this lecture is basically how humans impact their environment at different stages in time. And early humans in the hunter-gatherer stage of humanity, where we really didn't have very many people on planet Earth, and most people kind of lived off the land, eating plants and animals. We had pretty minor human environmental impacts. So what I mean by minor is that we were more part of nature. We were more part of the environment, just kind of like any other animal or plant. Just kind of doing our own thing, hunting, finding what food we can, and possibly the only real impact is that maybe as the human population began growing more and more, some species like our woolly mammoths maybe partially was hunted to extinction. Remember, this was also a time, when woolly mammoths died out about 10,000 years ago. This was a time where we went from an ice age to a warmer planet, and it's possible that climate change also contributed to the death of the species, but probably having a bunch of cavemen constantly hunting you didn't help either. So it's possible that humans led to some extinction events early on, or at least contributed to them. And technically that would result in a loss of biodiversity. And that's a word that we will talk about a lot in this class. Biodiversity is the number of species in an area or on planet Earth, period. So when a species goes extinct or gets endangered or rare in number, we say biodiversity goes down. So we're losing biodiversity as humans go up in population and begin eating more and more, they're hunting potentially things to extinction. But that's about it. Compared to today, that's pretty minor. A huge change, though, happened around 12,000 years ago. This is sort of widely believed to be the sort of beginnings of civilization in a way, because humans discovered farming, and the oldest kind of farming tools that we can find uh, date back to the Middle East. So, yeah, this is the part of the world where we find the oldest sort of farming tools. And as a word, the word agricultural or agriculture in general, that means it's the same word as farming. So, this is where farming started. And farming pretty much changed everything. So, instead of me as a caveman having to run around and find food and hunt animals, and it's a very dangerous life where I don't actually get much. Now all of a sudden I can clear an area out, plant a bunch of seeds, build a little home, and stay put and have all the food I want. That's massive. That's a unbelievable change to the world. And it also was the first time that we started seeing things like cities and towns. If everybody can kind of stay put, then now you kind of have a basis of uh, a place where you might gather to kind of exchange goods, the basis of an economy. You have enough food now that you can support a bigger population. And all of a sudden now maybe not everybody has to be a hunter-gatherer. We can have a handful of farmers that grow food for everybody, and then everybody else can work on other stuff, like, I don't know, making clothes, making baskets, making homes, cutting down trees, generating wood, all that stuff. Without farming, you have none of that. So farming, we call it the agricultural revolution because it was revolutionary. It changed everything about humanity. And unfortunately, it didn't change everything for the better. So this is really the first time in human history where, yes, we were growing our population and we were expanding, and people, for the most part, were not starving as much anymore. And they were living potentially longer lives, and the starting of cities and things like that. But on the downside is that now they're consuming so many more resources that their impact on the environment is much higher. And so some of these environmental problems that started with agriculture and really have never gone away include things like sewage, which is basically human waste, poop and pee. And we will talk a lot about poop and pee in this course. It's just part of life. But, you know, when you have a bunch of cavemen living in the forest and they're, you know, just kind of pooping and peeing everywhere as they're walking around and moving along, it's really not a big deal. They're just kind of like any other animal. But now all of a sudden you have a city of 100,000 people all living in kind of one spot, and they're all pooping and peeing. Uh, you know, that's going to build up over time. And the early cities didn't really have a way of dealing with it. You know, today we have modern plumbing, we have pipes, we can go send it out to the ocean or to the river or whatever. Back in the day, you know, people just kind of, it's a little gross. There's something called a bedpan. Basically, if you had to poop or pee over the night or during the day or whatever, you would either just poop it anywhere outside, or you would go in a pan and then you would just kind of toss it out in the street. So that's unimaginably gross, and obviously that's very unsanitary. So you get lots of things like disease and rats building up, all kinds of nasty stuff in your streets. And so in this sense, maybe human health really wasn't improved by this modernization of life. This is also, for the most part, you know, maybe I need to look a little bit into history, but to my knowledge, in terms of like hunter and gatherer civilization, you know, the idea of like colonization or slavery was not going to be all that common. Um, yes, you might have different tribes kind of go to war with one another, but the idea of a slave forcing somebody else to do work on your behalf, if everybody is scrambling around and just trying to find food by hunting and gathering, and everybody's kind of constantly going hungry, you cannot afford the luxury of having anybody not working. So, you know, I'm sure there was a bit of the idea of like social class or economic class back in hunter-gatherer tribes and civilizations, but the differences in economic class and social class back in hunter-gatherer civilization would have been a lot less than it is after we have agriculture. And now you can colonize a people and force them to work in the fields and provide food for you and all that stuff. I mean, that all came with agriculture as well. Deforestation, that's the idea of cutting down trees and cutting down forests. Well, if we need to grow food and we're kind of out of open space, well, let's go cut down that forest and start a farm there. So that's the agricultural revolution started about 12,000 years ago. And the most recent sort of era of human history we refer to as the Industrial Revolution. That I think it was kind of a direct consequence of science. So as we got better and better at science, we just got better and better at inventing new things and new technologies. And so this usage of technologies, and what I mean by that is factories and cars and trains and all that stuff, began about 250 years ago. So, late 1700s, early 1800s is really when we start the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And industry means just that. It's the cars and factories and trains and all that stuff. And yes, we got a lot of science, but you can also see from this picture, the environmental problems start cranking up even more. So what kind of modern environmental impacts came from the Industrial Revolution? Well, all of the previous ones that were there, plus some new ones. So all the previous ones of deforestation and invasive species and unsanitary streets and all that stuff were here, but now we have more, which were the idea of resource depletion is real in the world. The thing that really fueled, I know I said that science was really the driver of the Industrial Revolution. From another perspective, it was energy and energy resources. And what I mean by that are things like oil, coal, natural gas, things that we dig up from the ground and burn in our machines to do work for us. And the thing about these resources is that we call them non-renewable, or in other words, they're going to run out one day. And what happens when you run out of something that the entire world is based off of? Not good. Something else that they run, burning all these resources like coal and oil and natural gas, all brings pollution in the air. This is a picture down here of particularly bad days in China where the wind kind of gets stagnated or it doesn't really move much, so there's not much wind, and all the coal-fired power plants there are releasing all this smoke. It gets trapped into the city, and basically it gets so bad that on some days you really just can't even see very far. That's obviously bad for you to breathe and all that stuff. Of course, there's also water pollution, plastic pollution, all kinds of stuff. And the really big one would be global warming, which all of this, it's a complicated process, but basically we will discuss it thoroughly later in class. But all this pollution is trapping additional heat on Earth and causing the entire planet to warm up. And that's also really bad. So let's just kind of summarize this human history and what I've kind of taught you here in this short lecture. And let's look at it in terms of the human population. So this graph is to scale. And so, look over here on the left side, we start with 1 billion and we're going up to 7 billion and a bit above 7 billion. And over here, we're talking about over 10,000 years ago. 10,000 BCE is actually about 12,000 years ago. And we're moving to over here, which is present day. So over this stretch of time of about 12,000 years, we started with a population on Earth of about 4 million people, and now we're at 7.7 billion people. And this was not like some kind of slow, straight trajectory as we got more and more people on planet Earth. 1,000 years ago, right about here, we were sitting at maybe 200 million people, maybe 300 million people. Over the last 500 years, we've taken the human population and we've multiplied it by over 20. So we took 250 million people and turned it into 7.7 billion people, all in a blink of the eye in terms of human history. And if we kind of superimpose our eras over this, so the ones I just went over, which we started with the hunter-gatherer era over here on the left side, and hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago basically marked the beginning of the agricultural era. And before that, we were all pretty much just hunter-gatherers. Keep in mind that this is not to scale. So the hunter-gatherer era is actually the longest era for human history. If we wanted to make that graph, we would need about 15 more computer screens and put those off to the left side of your screen. So that would be the hunter-gatherer era. And then the agricultural era, you can see that the human population did expand quite a bit. Went from 4 million to 200 million, 300 million, something like that. And then in the industrial era, which has really just been a blink of the eye, the last 250 years, the human population has just completely exploded off the chart. And, I'm not like a population alarmist. A lot of people look at these graphs and they start bursting out, oh, well, we need fewer people. We can't have this many people. Planet Earth is huge. It's not that big compared to the universe, as we learned, but it is a big place. And I think there are resources here to support that many people. But what I'm more concerned about is like, what's the plan? How is this pattern sustainable? And what that word means is, if we've expanded the population by, over 7 billion in a blink of an eye, what's the next 100 years going to look like? Or the next 1,000 years going to look like? Or the next 10,000 years going to look like for humanity? Because at this rate, at some point, we are going to exhaust Earth's resources. And that's not going to be a pretty picture. Anyway, hopefully that kind of gives you an overview of the pattern of humanity, at least from my perspective. Humans started out pretty simply, and life was pretty rough as hunter-gatherers, and that was the vast majority of human history. So it's kind of interesting to think about. We feel very disconnected from like cavemen. But something that I like to think about is that, okay, so I have a dad, and then I have a grandfather, and we can get a great-grandfather, and I can keep going back and back. And for me to exist, a whole bunch of humans needed to exist before me, and those are my ancestors. The vast majority of my ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Kind of an interesting perspective. So, that makes me feel a little less disconnected from that life. And then we figured out farming, and that was huge because life got much easier at that point because we had food and we had, this guitar, which is one of my favorite things to do, is play music. Nothing like that probably would have existed in the hunter-gatherer culture. They might have had some kind of primitive music and art, but the idea that you would have the time to build a guitar or research how to build a guitar and figure that out while you're spending the majority of your time trying to hunt a woolly mammoth, it's just not happening. So agriculture was huge. And as much as it did to kind of progress humanity, it also started kind of leading us down to a path of environmental destruction where for us to kind of build up, we kind of had to destroy the natural world. And then that brings us to the most recent period of time, which was the Industrial Revolution, which was all, we could almost call it like the energy revolution, where we began harvesting these ancient resources, coal, oil, and gas. We'll talk about where they come from later on in the course, and use them to fuel all kinds of technology and innovation. But again, all that progression of humanity means the sort of comes at the expense of the destruction of Earth. A question I find myself reflecting on and thinking about a lot in environmental science is that can we kind of grow and progress as humans without actually completely destroying our planet in the process? Because if we destroy the planet, we might destroy ourselves. So there's some food for thought for you. And those last 3 or 4 lectures there now should hopefully give you a good idea of science, of the size of our universe and where Earth came from, some of Earth's history, and now some of humanity's history. Maybe you know all that, maybe not, but you probably learned some new perspectives over those last 4 lectures, and that will kind of lay the groundwork for everything we'll be talking about this year. So, I guess I'm done. See you later in class.